Well, we are going to be starting out here on the first 8 verses of chapter 12 in Romans here tonight. And just kind of want to start out the very first word of chapter 12 is therefore. And a long time ago, somebody said, whenever you see that, what is it there for? So it's, Paul's saying therefore. So he's referencing everything he wrote before. And so what did Joe talk about here last week, especially at the very end of chapter 11? And even like in the first 11 chapters of Romans, if you had to briefly synopsize, that's a new word now, what would it be? What is the therefore talking about? No fair. You taught last week. We'll see how good you did. So what did we wind up in verse 11? Chapter 11. That's what I meant. Yeah, that too. Yes. Right. Yeah, and just to just kind of repeat what she said. Yeah, when we realize the grace and the mercy that God has extended to all of us. Not only, the Jews, but also the Gentiles. Because remember when we started this, they were talking about how Paul was laying out the case in a very logical manner, and that even Harvard Law School early on used this in their curriculum. And as Paul has laid out, that it's not through works, but it's through mercy and grace that we are saved. And not only the children of Israel, but also the Gentiles. And he ended out with like this big doxology, just a worship, thing there in the doxology here. So, that's kind of how he ended up here. And he starts out with therefore. And so think about that a little bit when we're going to be watching the video here in the next few minutes here. But also, so kind of the teaser question here, that's probably on your sheet, is, think of like a really good gift you've got. Can anybody think of like, the best gift they ever received? Well, salvation, yeah, okay. How about another, other gifts? That's certainly a good one. Salvation is definitely a good one. Others? Joe.
I told you what date's coming up for me.
Yep.
I can remember all the way back to kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
And I got the most coolest thing ever. I got a giant, Jolly Green giant stuffed doll that was bigger than me.
Okay.
That's the coolest gift in the world I ever got.
Neat. So kind of it says, we all enjoy receiving gifts, but we're not always eager to share them as we are to receive them. When we became Christians, God gave us spiritual gifts or abilities, strength, and talents we can share with the church. These gifts are meant for building up the body, his church. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that and thinking about that. So with that in mind, we're going to be watching the video, and then we'll kind of go through the scriptures and kind of discuss it. So like I said, we started out there with, the therefore, and then there's a lot of stuff that came after it. So in the first 11 verses there, Paul defined the gospel, and now he begins exploring how the gospel changes us. So how would you define the gospel, and in what ways is the gospel still changing your life today? So first of all, what's the gospel? Yep, Jesus came to save us. And what did somebody else say? Good news. Yep, good news. So, in what ways is the gospel still changing our lives today? So I'm going to read the first 2 verses. And here again, I'm reading out of the NIV, and it says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, And there, that's the first 11 verses, chapters there. To offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. A lot of stuff there to unpack. And so just to start out, it says, in view of the mercies of God. So the gospel is the foundation for our whole lives. We don't live to earn God's mercy. We live in light of God's mercy. So how has God been merciful to you? And in what ways does his mercy affect your daily habits and decisions? Reached down and saved us, yes. In my life, I just think, how come God doesn't say, what a knucklehead? This guy keeps like tripping up on certain things on a pretty regular basis. But yet he never says, that's it, that's just it, you're done. He gives me the opportunity to learn and each time get a little bit better. So it's like his mercies are new every day. And so, yeah, Joe.
You mentioned this previously.
Yeah, mercy and grace, yes. So that's what he's saying, in view of his mercy. So the next thing he talks about is, it says we should be a living sacrifice. So what do you think it looks like to present our body as a living sacrifice? Once upon a time, somebody said the only problem with the big problem with a living sacrifice is it's able to crawl off the altar, and I thought that was pretty funny. But what does that mean to you when you read that? We, present our bodies as a living sacrifice.
Sacrificing what you want to do.
Sacrificing what we want to do. Surrender, okay. Right, yeah, serving others and, right. What's interesting, that word living, when you think of like the Old Testament sacrifices, you read about this. Once the sacrifice came in and they sacrificed it, that was done. It was a one and done type deal. But, our bodies as living sacrifices, we get to do it over and over and over so we can, continue in our lives, to sacrifice it to live for God. So then it says, after urging readers to offer themselves wholly to God, Paul drives his point home further. This is your true worship, he said at the end of verse 1. So worship isn't only confined to singing in church like we sometimes assume. It is an ongoing mark of our every day in our lives. So, what are some ways that we can seek to worship God with our whole life daily? When you think, worship, you think, yeah, okay, 3 songs on Sunday morning, sometimes 4. But what's that mean? What's that?
You hit a little too close to home there.
Yeah. Yeah. What's that mean? How do we seek to worship God with our whole life? Or, daily? What's, oh. What? Okay, yep, starting off your day in his word. That's always a good one. And I think one thing, and I thought it was a great one, he said, God didn't save us to be, sitting on a sanctified shelf. He's given us stuff to do, and part of it is to give him the glory. Because let's face it, it's easy to take credit for ourselves, but if we really are honest with ourselves, it all be our skills, abilities, just the fact that we were born into this situation is all due to God. So, he should get the glory and the thanks and the praise. So then in verse 2, he talks about, do not conform any longer to the pattern of the world. So what does it look like to be conformed to the age in which we live And how can we guard ourselves against disobeying Paul's warning here? So what does it look like to be conformed to the age which we live in? And how can we guard ourselves against disobeying Paul's thing? So he says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. What's that look like? Yep. Yeah, running contrary to Scripture. You know, it's kind of the antithesis of worshiping God. I, me, mine, taking credit for everything and hogging the glory for ourselves. So it's kind of interesting as I was kind of preparing this that, that God sent a couple of really good things. And I don't know if anybody ever listens to any podcasts here. Has anybody listened to Red Pilled America? It's an interesting podcast to listen to. And I listened to WTVN on the way into work, just, traffic and weather and all that good stuff. And they had an advertisement on this and it was like the podcast, why all of a sudden are drag queens like so prevalent in everything in society? So I said, well, that sounds interesting. So I listened to it last night. And it was very, very interesting. It was about an hour long, and I won't give away all of it because it's, just go ahead and listen to it. It's pretty interesting. But it talked about kind of like how we got here, and a lot of it was back to they traced it back anyway to a televangelist in the 90s trying to say he's going to go basically save San Francisco, and he publicized it. I think the last guy's name was Lee. I had never really heard of him, but they had talked about that, it really, he did it very publicly, and he really ignited the homosexual community in San Francisco. And so what happened there was a lot of organized warfare against the church here, starting at that time, and to the point where a lot of churches have kind of pulled back from preaching the gospel. And then it kind of went into this one guy's story who grew up in just north of Atlanta. In the early 2000s, kind of came of age there, and his parents were involved in a mega church, and he had all kinds of different things happening to him. But he was saying that he was kind of drawn in to the LGBT community, and there was various things that happened there. But he had never heard anything in church about God's truth as it relates to that it was just not talked about. And he got, and it's followed it. He, got acceptance, and it was interesting because he was talking also about, he said, when, people say, are you born that way or not? He goes, in his case, he says, yes, I was born that way, but not what you think. But he says it was part of original sin, that part of it. And he talked about how he just, his journey in there. And then he was going to go take a job at Walt Disney World. And his mom said, well, instead of doing that, I want you to go, how about going to this Bible college or this ministry school? And he didn't want to, but he said, yeah, okay, I will. And, he had really gone a long way down the path, drugs and promiscuity and just everything. And he went there, and he said and he said he knew how to all the lingo because he grew up in church. But he and he talked about how his first time there was a worship service that somebody invited him to, and he talked about how God got a hold of his heart. And then from that worship service, how God just kind of started him on the journey away from that. And when I heard about the caterpillar analogy, he talked about that. how, how God just kind of worked to rewire his brain. And then he told his mom he was only going to, try it for one semester. Well, he stayed there a year. And then, he went back home for the summer, and he kind of slipped back into his old ways a little bit, but he went back. And then he basically got a job at, I think it was, it might have been Olive Garden, I think. And so there was a bunch of other, students that worked there too. And there was a gal that he kind of became friends with, and she talked about how she was going to get married to another woman, and just kind of a parallel journey, and talked about how, basically, though they wound up, from friendship to attraction to marriage, and now they're in ministry. And I mean, it is a really neat story to listen to. But he was talking about that. He said that it wasn't a thing of gay or straight. It was broken and whole. And he said, yeah, he believes some people are born with that bent, but it is part of original sin, And so it was just really neat that it really just dovetailed with this. So Red Pilled America, listen to it. There's a lot of neat stuff in there, but that's the one that they've got up now, the most current one. Yes.
Will the Red Pill come to a conclusion, like a point of origin or anything?
What's that about?
About drag queens?
Well, I mean, that's, at the end, the guy was talking about it is definitely, a move of the community to groom. I mean, the guy.
Why the media is like suddenly.
Well, they traced it back to like the 60s. So, I mean, there's a lot of good history in there. And there was like, they did a real good job of tracing it out, and just, how it's gone from, a fringe thing to being accepted to being promoted. And, the whole thing, like I said, I was like, hey, it was that, but it was more about this guy's story, which is just a marvelous story of a caterpillar right there. And he just lays it out. Yeah.
I think that's
And it's an age-old pattern. You read about it, about this stuff in history books, and even in the Old Testament.
the days of the Roman Empire.
Right.
They had it all.
Exactly.
Just didn't have it on TV because they hadn't invented TV yet.
Right. Or the internet. But I thought it was really interesting how they were talking about how so many of the churches these days that are afraid to discuss this, or are afraid to even preach on the truth of God. And I'm thinking, thank you, Jesus, that we're a member of a church where that ain't so. That, Pastor Frank, you'll hear the word in the truth. And then he said, that just how warped he was growing up because nobody told him the truth. Yep. So I just thought that was really interesting. So, and that just kind of it's the next question is, in what ways does God change us from within when he saves us? And how does this inward change differ from what J.D. called, religious change? Yes, Joe.
I love the word.
Well, the whole caterpillar analogy is just so strong. When it talks about, the whole, like his body dissolves, and, and it's like, it's not in there reading flight manuals or trying to strap wings on it. It kind of goes what Pastor Joe said, hey, the Masons, the great architect, we're doing more good than bad, so we're going to make it, trying to do it on our own. Rather than just letting God renew our minds and renew our thoughts and all that. And it can happen. I mean, that's the business our God's in. Yep. Amen to that.
I don't get my thinking strong on the right track.
I'm right there with you, brother, man, because I can find the off-ramps here really easy. Really easy. So yeah, that just leads us into the next question that I thought was interesting. And it says, we are to be transformed, Paul says, by the renewing of our minds. Real change begins in our minds, like you said. What occupies your stray thoughts, daydreams, and anxieties? Where do you normally focus your attentions? What things could you focus on less In what things could you focus on more? Is that something you want to focus on more or less?
Well, I focus on it too much, probably.
Yeah, okay. Your next meal. Yeah, if you ever are looking for a really good restaurant recommendation, there's the dude you want to talk to. Pastor Joe. Other things, what's some things that we could focus on less, and what are some things we could focus on more? Less on negativity, yes. That is a great one. So then the flip side of that is focus on things that are positive.
Which is the Word of God.
Yep. Something's going to come in, right. Everything's very accessible these days. Yeah, that reminds me when our kids were younger, when, they're all ancient now, they're all adults. But I remember when we had our first kid, and my wife and I were watching something on TV, and he came in the room, and it's like, oh, we better turn that off. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. If it's not good for him to watch, should we really be watching it? And so we had to look at so what were we watching? And it's like, okay. So that radically changed our viewing habits. Not radically, but I mean, it really changed our viewing habits. I mean, what are you putting in your mind? I mean, and this is like one of the worst things right now. What are you looking at on your phone? What's getting put in your mind, and what are you filling your eyes and your mind with? Yes. Look, yep. His wonderful face. Things of this world, strangely dim. Right. Oh yeah, that's what lifelong lessons right there. Mm-hmm. Another thing that just popped into my mind when you said this, back in the 90s when I was building the house we're living in now, and then a friend of mine, we were building them together, like right next to each other. And very frustrating, at times, doing that. And I remember there'd be time to and he says, just remember, one day these are all going up in a ball of fire. And it's like, okay, that kind of puts it in perspective. Okay, this isn't a big deal then. Yeah, like one day all this stuff you were worried about is all going up in a ball of fire. So, I'm like, okay, that kind of puts it in perspective. And there's been more than one time, and it's like, okay, yep, one day this is all going up in a ball of fire. Not a big deal, So then we shift on that from, renewing our minds, things we should think about more, things that we should think about less, to he talks a little bit about going on about God's will. And then we'll talk about verse 3 he ended up there by transforming to renew our mind. Then we'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And we'll only know that when our mind gets renewed. And it says, for by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. And so when you think about that, so have you ever thought, how can we trust that God's will is good, pleasing, and perfect? In the moments when you wonder what God's will is, how can these words encourage you? So it says, how can we trust that God's will is good, pleasing, and perfect? How can we trust that? Holy, loving God, yes. Right. Mm-hmm. Since I'm a car guy, I always kind of think of it in those terms. I think of this as the owner's manual. If you want your car to last long and to give you good service and stuff, you follow the owner's manual. You don't change the oil. You don't drive it right. You don't maintain it and do that. It's going to break down, and you're going to have lots of problems. This is the owner's manual. God gave us the owner's manual. So he made us. So we can trust what he says to us. So, like, looking at there, and then in verse 3, it says, Paul urges readers not to think of themselves more highly than they should. What are some of the characteristics of someone who thinks more highly of themselves than they should, and how can we guard against proud behavior? So what are some of the characteristics of someone who thinks more highly of themselves than they should? Yes. Yep, taking credit for, yep. Anything else? Yep, and that's the other side of the coin. Yep, not taking responsibility for things you should. Although, you know what's one thing that's interesting that I noticed shortly after I started going here? I remember one of the first, I don't know, maybe it was one of the big like Wednesday night dinners before, the kickoff when they do all the barbecue and stuff like that. I remember the first time I came to that, all kinds of stuff going on. And at the end, I looked, and there was Pastor Frank doing the trash, taking trash cans, taking them out, tying it up, and doing all that stuff. And I'm thinking, he's the pastor of like this really big, successful church. He's out there, taking care of the garbage. What a great example. I looked at that and I'm like, okay, I can get behind somebody like that. So, it'd be real easy for him to go, well, no, that's not my job. I got, this. So, yeah, staying humble.
And he's never changed.
No.
I've known him since 1991.
Yep. So in the next sentence, Paul offers an alternative, and he says, think sensibly as God has distributed a measure of faith to each one. Paul calls each of us to think of ourselves wisely and humbly. So in what ways is sensible thinking a healthy alternative to thinking too highly of oneself? I think we talked about that. It kind of like puts everything in perspective, I think, and when we look at what do we, who do we look up to? Right there is something that's neat. Okay, I want to emulate that. Servant leadership. Right? Right, and I also think it's good to have an eternal perspective. Like one of the days, this is all going up in the big ball of fire. What we're in here right now, and I think I heard a sermon about like the little dash on your gravestone. That's where we're living right now. But if you just think this little brief period of, 70, 80, maybe 90 years, in view of eternity, this is nothing, So you kind of got to look at it in view of that. And did anybody else go to the thing last Saturday night, the Valentine's Day banquet? I loved the great line when he was talking about the doctors, man, what are you going to do when you get to heaven? There's nothing. And then he dished on lawyers. And then he even said, and what about Pastor Frank? Do you think when, God's going to say, hey, Isaiah, sit down. We got Frank Carl here, I thought that was hilarious, but yeah, just putting it into perspective. So, and then Paul introduces readers to an important metaphor that's used in multiple places in the New Testament. He says, just like our own body, Christians are members of one body in Christ, with each member having its own unique function while still belonging to the one body. I thought that was really interesting, his metaphor there about, the elbow wanting scratched and stuff like that. And so how does Paul's metaphor help you understand your own place in the body of Christ? And in what ways does Paul's metaphor apply to the local church where you belong and our contributions there? Anybody thought about that? Or when he's talking about spiritual gifts and, and about how it relates to the local church? Well, it was really neat where Pastor Joe was talking about when he looks around, just all the different ways people are serving. I remember I asked you once, Pastor Joe, how many people are I think you did a survey of last year, how many people were involved in some form of ministry. What was that number?
Around 800.
Around 800.
And that's called to serve.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting just because here again, this is kind of the weird way I'm wired sometimes. I'll usually count how many people are up there on the platform, and usually there's between 70 and 80 people up there on the platform on Sunday morning. And I'm thinking, man, how many churches would just love to have that many people in church? So I'm willing to bet. Now, I can speak from this from experience. If you're looking for a place to serve, there's a person sitting in the back of the room, if he senses that, is going to plug you into something. Pastor Joe's, that's his spiritual gift of getting people plugged in to do something. And he's very good at gentle arm twisting. But it's good. It's a good thing. No, it's kind of interesting. So along those lines, here again, I was just looking at something on my phone, and it's like, oh, here's another podcast. And oh, wow, they were interviewing my son-in-law, who happens to be on staff. He's a worship pastor at Vineyard. And he was talking about his spiritual journey and how he wound up where he is right now. And he was just talking about all the kind of gentle nudgings of the Spirit and how, he followed him. He went to Ohio State for marketing. He says, because that's what you go into when you don't know what you want to do. And, how during that whole process when he was in high school and then in college, how God was just doing the little nudges here and there and opening some little doors. And he goes, yeah, I'll try that. And just how he said, one of the things he got involved in ministry, and, this one was for 10 hours. And, okay, well, then it ended. Well, now what do I do? Well, this one, 20 hours. And then that one, that got eliminated. And he goes, I got better start interviewing. And then, here came something good. We're a cheap living situation. Well, I can stay. But, he just kind of followed the nudgings of the Spirit and just said yes and, made himself available to it. And, and so that was one of the things, and it was really interesting when I was listening to that. And it was the whole thing what, the JD was talking about, what has God gifted you? What have people commented on? And where those all intersect, is probably where you should be serving. And so I thought that was very interesting. And what do you think about, do you agree or disagree with what JD was talking about, like the Lone Ranger Christians, and talked about them almost being arrogant, or, how he said that? Did you agree, disagree with that? Because, I've heard people, oh, well, I can worship by myself, or I can do this, I can watch online, and that. So, what do you think about that? Right? It is so crucial that you get part of, you get plugged into a local body of believers somehow. And in a church as big as this, it'd be real easy to get lost or to just be a ninja Christian, pop in and pop out. And so it says a whole lot about the health of the church, where it seems like over half the people that attend here are plugged in somehow in ministry. And it is just, I know in my own life, there was a time where I got kind of super busy at work and super busy. And I was working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. This is when I was much younger and could do that and not kill myself. But I got, it was a season where I wouldn't say I had to do it, but I chose to do it. And, one of the things that suffered was church attendance, and that's like, well, first it was just a couple of weeks, but then it's like, it's real easy to get out of the habit. And then when nobody called, it's like, well, I guess nobody cares. But all it took was one person to call and say, I haven't seen you in a while. Are you doing okay? And I was about ready to say yes, but I said, matter of fact, no. And, some people came alongside me and helped me out, but if nobody had done that, I might not be here today. So, that's been kind of a reminder sometime if I haven't seen somebody in a while. May not be a bad idea to just give them a call or stop over and say, because it's easy for someone to say to an email, I'm fine or I'm okay. But if, you look somebody in the eye and say, how you doing? Sometimes that's all it takes. And they just, want someone to know that they care. And yeah, if you're a Lone Ranger Christian, that ain't happening. So.